Hello and welcome to all of you who are attending our TRED Talk this evening via Zoom and all of us watching live on Facebook. I'm Jessica Karlsruher, the Executive Director of TRED Coalition, and I will be your moderator for this evening. For those of you who aren't very familiar with TRED, the acronym stands for the Texas Real Estate Advocacy and Defense Coalition. We are a nonpartisan, member-based organization that advocates for and defends rural landowners and their communities at the federal, state, and local levels. And I have put our contact information in the chat box located on the right-hand side. This is also where you can submit questions to our panelists, and we will be addressing those questions at the end of this panel discussion. TRED Talks is our newest educational programming connecting landowners, experts, legislators, and the general public on issues affecting rural landowners and their communities across the state. Our programming covers issues like water, conservation, ranching, health, education, eminent domain, and most recently broadband, which brings us to tonight's discussion on broadband connectivity in rural Texas. With us this evening are four seasoned panelists on broadband and how it affects rural communities, and in particular, education and healthcare. I'll start with Kara Belew. She is the founder and president of Tenant Leadership. As a national school system leadership expert, she coaches hundreds of school board members, system leaders, and teachers each year to improve student results. She is also a regulatory advisor for the Texas Public School Charter Association. Kara worked at the Texas Public Policy Foundation as Senior Education Policy Advisor and led efforts to formulate policies to use taxpayer funds more effectively to improve student outcomes in Texas, and played an integral role in developing statewide budget policies. Prior to TPPF, Kara worked as Deputy Commissioner of Finance for the Texas Education Agency and managed the state's $60 billion per year school finance system. Prior to TEA, Belew served as State Budget Director for Governor Greg Abbott. And in that capacity, she helped to pass and fund the governor's education legislative initiatives, including teacher reading and mathematics academies and reading excellence teams. Kara was also a part of Governor Rick Perry's administration as team leader and senior education advisor for public education policy, helping to pass and implement legislation to ensure college and career readiness standards for the state's public education system. Her work also focused on school finance and economic development issues. She was appointed to the Education Commission of the states and serves on the board of the Texas High School Project, now known as Educate Texas, which created STEM and early college high schools statewide. In addition to her work in two gubernatorial administrations, Kara worked at the Office of the Attorney General as senior counsel. And in that leadership position, she helped formulate the legal strategy for the state's successful school finance litigation. A graduate with honors from Southern Methodist University with degrees in accounting and political science, Kara worked for 5 years at PricewaterhouseCoopers as a senior associate on major public accounts. She became a CPA in 2000 and attended the University of Texas Law School, where she graduated with honors. Following law school, she completed a 2-year law clerkship with the Supreme Court of Texas. In her commitment to community service, Kara serves on the boards of Literacy First, a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring Texas students are reading by the 3rd grade, and Durrell, Texas charter schools. Kara is also a certified school board trainer with expertise in helping school boards and schools focus on improving student results. Thank you, Kara, for being here. Gary Bolton serves as president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association, the largest trade association in the Americas dedicated to all fiber optic broadband. And with more than 3 decades in the telecom industry, Gary joined the Fiber Broadband Association as president and CEO in 2020 after serving on the association's board as vice chairman, treasurer, and vice chair of public policy and marketing committees. Prior to taking the leadership role at Fiber Broadband Association, Gary spent 11 years at AdTran, serving as vice president of global marketing and government affairs. AdTran is a top 3 global provider of broadband infrastructure solutions. At AdTran, Gary was responsible for all aspects of marketing for the company worldwide, as well as regulatory and government affairs. Gary has been highly involved in Washington, particularly on FCC and congressional proceedings and international trade issues. Prior to AdTran, Gary held executive management positions at two successful venture-backed high-tech startups, as well as a large publicly traded companies in marketing and product line management. Gary served as the chairman of Huntsville Chamber of Commerce, co-chairman of BitTag, which is the Broadband Internet Technology Advisory Group, a board member at Huntsville Botanical Garden and the Chamber Foundation, president for Sorba Huntsville, and an MIT CEO mentor at Hudson Alpha, Leadership Alabama, Leadership Huntsville, and served on the University of Alabama and Huntsville College of Business Executive Advisory Board. Gary currently is an adjunct professor in business administration and management science at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and holds an MBA from Duke University and a BS in electrical engineering from North Carolina State University. Next up, we have Jennifer Harris, who is State Program Director for Texas for Connected Nation. It's a national 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is to improve the lives by providing innovative solutions that expand access to and increase the adoption and use of broadband and its related technologies for all people. Jennifer also serves on the Governor's Broadband Development Council and represents Texas in the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's State Broadband Leaders Network. Having worked in state government since 2005, Jennifer has held a wide range of jobs in the public sector. Her professional experience includes legislative, public policy, communications, and government affairs work with the Texas legislature and policy and communications work for the Florida Department of Education, along with a variety of roles on local and statewide political campaigns. Jennifer earned her bachelor's in business administration with a focus in marketing from the McCombs School of Business at UT Austin. She earned her master's in public service and administration from the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. And lastly, we have Christie Kremer, nurse practitioner. She an FNP, BC, ACHPN. Christie has 23 years of experience in healthcare, the past 11 years in the role of family nurse practitioner. She received her master's in nursing from the University of Texas at Austin and is a board certified family nurse practitioner, in addition to being an advanced certified hospice and palliative, am I pronouncing that right? Palliative care nurse, and holds postmaster certification from the University of Texas at Austin. Christie was a clinical instructor in nursing with the University of Texas at Austin for 3 years and has worked in hospice and palliative medicine for more than 7 years, including 5 years with Hospice Austin. She enjoys providing patient-centered care and focuses on the patient's goals for care and family education and support. So as you can see, we have a very seasoned panel, and I am thrilled to have such experience and expertise with us tonight. So thank you all for being here with us this evening. So let's get right to it. The first question I'd like to start off with this evening is, what is broadband? And so I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Harris, who has a presentation from Texas for Connected Nation that answers that question. And we'll also add some additional information to lead us through tonight's discussion. So Jennifer.
Thanks so much. Let me get my screen up for y'all. So what is broadband? Perfect question. That's how I start every single presentation I give. Broadband is something we've heard about for years and years and years, but what does that actually mean? Well, in its simplest form, broadband is just high-speed internet. But what does high speed mean? Well, that's actually changed over the course of time. Currently, broadband is defined as a 25 megabit per second download and a 3 megabit per second upload. Don't worry, I'll explain what that means on the next slide. Those numbers don't make a lot of sense, but that is what the definition set by the Federal Communications Commission currently is. The reason those numbers are important is because that's what federal funding is based around, is that speed of broadband. So when you hear the word unserved, you're considered unserved if you don't have 25.3. Many states and organizations have definitions of underserved, which may be different speeds higher than 25.3 that are all unique to their states or organizations. But as far as unserved, in both Texas and with the Federal Communications Commission, we focus on that 25.3 number. Broadband can be provided to the home for many different technologies, though we all know fiber is the backbone. And fiber, we can get fiber to the home. I currently have a fiber to the home connection for broadband at my house, which I feel fortunate to have. But you can also get broadband speeds through DSL, through cable. Obviously, mobile broadband exists, and 5G is becoming more prevalent, at least in urban areas, not so much in rural areas. We see a lot of fixed wireless in our rural areas because it's more cost effective. And then satellite obviously is an option that exists for broadband, though often it has problems with latency, that time that it takes for a conversation like this. If you were to respond to me, that lag time between me saying something to you and you saying something back to me can be a problem with satellite. There is new satellite technology that many of us have heard about, the low Earth orbit satellite technology that is being developed by several folks, but probably most commonly known through SpaceX and Starlink. And so we're going to be continuing to follow that. I think everyone's going to follow that low Earth orbit satellite to see how that can really help rural communities, and then obviously all across the world to get connected when we have very sparse populations over large pieces of land that it would be really hard to lay fiber across. Those numbers that I said I would explain, what does a 25 megabit per second download really allow you to do? Well, pre-COVID, it probably worked in homes, for most people, because you probably weren't trying to use more than 3 to 5 devices to stream at a time. Probably 1 or 2, maybe more in the evenings, but it probably wasn't, probably might have worked pretty well for you. And I think that's why the federal definition had been set at 25. But I think what we've learned in this past year at home is that if we have kids trying to go to school and be on virtual classes with their teachers and parents trying to work from home, and you've got your Nest thermostat and your Wi-Fi crock pot and all of these other devices on at the same time, that 25 being split up between all those devices may just not be working for you quite as well as it might have been previously. There is conversation, not officially at the FCC, but definitely conversation directed at the FCC about increasing what that speed of broadband means. So something we should look at in the future and see what really happens there. You'll see that gig speed reference there. That's 1,000 versus 25. So definitely a significant increase in that speed. And pretty much at this point in time, you could do almost anything you want to do in your home with that type of speed connectivity. Further defining broadband, Connected Nation really focuses on broadband in a holistic way, from an access piece, an adoption piece, and a use piece. So of course, if you don't have physical access to broadband, you can't subscribe, nor could you use broadband. But even if you have physical access, maybe it's too expensive, or maybe you don't have the digital skills to use broadband, and so you're not subscribing. And so this is a supply and demand case that works both ways. Obviously, you can't subscribe if you don't have that access, but if communities aren't really wanting to subscribe, there's not a lot of reason to build infrastructure that companies don't think people are going to use. So it's definitely a consideration that we need to think about, is how many people actually want to subscribe to and use broadband. So that leads us to what Texas actually looks like as far as broadband. So this map on the right reflects where there is that 25.3 minimum broadband connectivity. So once again, what meets the definition of broadband might not meet our needs at our homes currently, but this is where it's physically available across the state. You can see it follows I-35, but as soon as you get east or west, that connectivity definitely falls off as far as that minimum speed being available. You'll see that almost 900,000 Texans don't have physical access to that minimum 25.3 speed. Maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but that sounds like a lot to me, because that would be like the entire state of South Dakota, no one in the state having broadband physical access at their home. And that's a lot of people. So we have to remember, Texas, 29, 30 million, whatever the census tells us, 900,000 is still a lot of folks. Interesting here on this piece is that where we don't have physical infrastructure, that physical connectivity to the home, 88% of that is in rural Texas, with only 12% being suburban or urban. So on this adoption piece, this is really where Texas is struggling even more, and what we've seen, I think, a lot, and Kara, you may be able to speak to this more, but on student connectivity and how this has really been highlighted, that so many students didn't have broadband at home that we discovered at the beginning of COVID. And that's a direct reflection of the fact that over 30% of Texas homes didn't have a subscription to broadband. And so maybe it was physically there, but they weren't subscribing. And that's either because they couldn't afford it, they just chose not to. I mean, I don't have cable at my house. I can afford cable, but I choose not to have cable. I would personally never choose not to have broadband, but some people make that choice. And so that may be a choice of what was going on in homes before we were all asked to stay home at all times and work from home and have our kids go to school from home. Texas ranks 35th among other states and territories as far as actually subscribing to broadband at home. I don't think that's very good. Texas likes to be a leader. We're definitely not a leader there. We don't even meet the national average as far as subscribing. So the country as a whole subscribes at a higher rate than Texas. So it's something that we really need to think about moving forward on broadband. The National Digital Inclusion Alliance, which is another national nonprofit focused on broadband, really in the adoption and subscription and use way. They do a study every year on communities of 65,000 or more. So not our rural communities, but I would expect many of them to be on this list. But communities of 65,000 or more will see that 4 of the top 5 worst connected cities in the entire country, as far as actually subscribing to broadband at home, are in Texas. And that's a direct reflection of the fact that only 68%, as we saw on the last slide, 68% of Texans are actually subscribing. And so we know that 4% are not subscribing because they don't physically have it. But what's going on between that 96% and that 68% that is causing folks not to subscribe? Definitely a conversation we need to have and understand, where those challenges are coming from. There are a few Texas broadband initiatives that I just want to highlight really quickly that happened prior to this legislative session. The first was the creation of the Governor's Broadband Development Council. As Jessica mentioned, I do serve on that council. I was honored to be appointed by Governor Abbott to this council in January of last year, right before the pandemic started. And we were able to meet virtually all of last year. Unfortunately, we've not had a full council meeting in person. I can't wait for the day that we're able to have a broadband council meeting and actually meet everyone on the council that we've been working with for over a year. But we were able to issue our statutorily required report on November 1st of last year, making the recommendations to the legislature and the executive leaders of our state to create a state broadband plan and establish a state broadband office, and then also look into some type of funding program to incentivize deployment in unserved areas, and if that made sense for the state of Texas. I'll show a slide that has a few bills on it in a couple slides, but those recommendations were directly reflected in both HB 5 and SB 5, which are the priority broadband bills in the House and Senate. They encompass all 3 of these recommendations. So it's great to see that this report really did help inspire potentially that legislation that is moving at a pretty quick pace through the legislature. Operation Connectivity is obviously a more current initiative than the Broadband Council, not much more current, but started in May of 2020 to really focus on students and making sure that they had connectivity at home. Initially, it was making sure that we could get hotspots out where hotspots worked, and then making sure that there was an e-learning device to every student so that they actually had that device at home to use. There's a longer term goal to get high-speed internet along with those devices to every single student in Texas. I can PDF these slides, Jessica, for y'all to send out after. These are links to press releases, and this is a link to an article from the Houston Chronicle that talks about the plan that TEA has to connect all students at home and how they're going to work with internet providers to do so. Obviously, it was Governor Abbott's first emergency item that he mentioned in his State of the State on February 1st. And I think that was going to be the hot topic of session until a few days later, we all lost electricity at our homes. And then that took a little bit more priority over broadband, but it is still an emergency item and a priority of both the House and the Senate. This is a handful of bills that I'm following. There's many, many more. I don't even want to say that these are the ones I think are going to pass or not pass. They just seem to be the ones that will probably have hearings, but please don't believe that this list is all inclusive. But we will see Senate Bill 5 on the Senate floor tomorrow. is what's anticipated. So that should be an interesting conversation. House Bill 5 will be on the House floor soon. It may not be next week, but could be the week after that. There's going to be conversations around text.right away, the Texas USF, middle mile, broadband, telehealth, obviously the education space, all sorts of issues to follow. I think in whole, if you add up all the education bills, telehealth bills, everything filed on broadband, there's about 60 bills that in some way, shape, or form are directly related to broadband, and probably many, many more that are indirectly related to broadband. So just absolutely a lot going on in this space, this legislative session. But those key ones to watch are SB 5 and HB 5, including SB 5 in the Senate tomorrow. And so that's just a little bit of a conversation starter to get us all talking. My information is here. If you'd like to reach out to me after this presentation to discuss anything, that's what I'm here for. I'm happy to chat.
Thank you, Jennifer. And so with that, I'd like to go over to Gary to kind of talk about the national perspective and, overall what you're focused on from fiber, broadband, and outreach.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Yes, I'm Gary Bolton. I'm with the Fiber Broadband Association. And, I think what Jennifer had described is a little bit about, I guess, some of the basics of broadband. And when you think about broadband, really, I look at it as jobs. And, what's happening in the nation now with the pandemic is that people are going to be working from home after this pandemic, right? And they're going to be doing hybrid education, and we're going to be doing, remote healthcare and so forth. And so if you think about those things, if you're not connected, then your community is going to be left behind forever. And, that whole digital divide is going to be, get widened. And so right now, if you think about, how are we going to move forward? So, we have about 40% of the US has been deployed with fiber optics. And what fiber optics are able to do, if you've heard the old Sprint commercial, pin drop, is it allows you to have limitless capacity. And also, since it's being able to shine light across a piece of glass, you're able to do this with very low maintenance and very low operating cost. And so that's kind of the ultimate goal for across the nation, is to be able to get this utility across. And so if you're able to, your community has fiber, then what you have is you have jobs. So to be able to get jobs to your community, and so if you think about everybody moving out of California and moving out of different, New York City and so forth, now that they can work from anywhere, why wouldn't they be living, Texas to be able to do their Silicon Valley job, or, be able to do their Wall Street job or any job in the country? And so, we looked at areas that have had fiber, like Chattanooga, Tennessee. They put in fiber about 10 years ago. And what we saw in Chattanooga is that fiber delivered 9,500 net new jobs. It also had $2.7 billion of economic impact to that community. But it's not just being able to have everybody connected with the world's fastest speeds and be able to have jobs and impact, but they were also able to do smart grid modernization. So Jennifer mentioned, the power issues that, that Texas has struggled with. So what the smart grid modernization for Chattanooga, for example, it reduced outages by 43%, and it provided over $500 million of benefit during major weather events, as well as reducing the overall electric consumption. So you think about broadband as really as critical as power and water. And then further, it provides the foundation for 5G, so as any of the applications for the future. So it's really important that you're able to put that in place to be able to move forward. Further, I guess making it more personal, if you have, fiber to your neighborhood, what that's going to do is it's going to increase your home price by $12,000, like on a $300,000 house. It's going to increase your rent if you're renting a condo by 3.4%, or it's going to increase your monthly rent on a your rent's going to go up 9%, and the value of you own the condo is going to go up 3.4%. So in short, it's really going to be it's critical that your communities do have gigabit services, have fiber that gets deployed to them. And as Jennifer pointed out, there's a number of things going on from the federal levels. Right now, there's the FCC did an auction on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. It was a $16 billion auction. $9 billion was awarded. The good news is that 85% of those awards were in the gigabit tier. So that's, the level of service that every community needs to be able to, do school from home, work from home, and be able to have this kind of economic impact. The bad news is that 85% of what was left over was awarded to Elon Musk and SpaceX for low Earth orbit satellites. And what you'll hear, and hopefully you guys will be a little better educated, but if you go to Starlink's website, it will say that something's better than nothing. And really, we don't want to have our rural communities in Texas being relegated to something better than nothing. And the challenge with being able to put nearly $1 billion of taxpayer money into space is that you're not building a path towards fiber. You're not going to be able to get that smart grid modernization. You're not going to have that path to 5G, and not going to be able to have the path to being able to have limitless capacity, because a decade ago, the national broadband plan was predicated on 1 megabit was the definition of broadband. None of us could have survived this pandemic on 1 megabit service. And so if we look at what's going to be required 10 years from now, it's going to be 2 gigabits symmetric, both upstream and downstream, for every home for a household of 4. And so if basically you don't have little spacemen that can go out and upgrade your satellites, those things fall out of the sky every 5 years, and you're going to be launching more and more satellites. So the net of it is don't let your rural communities get stuck with satellite. You really need to be able to provide that critical infrastructure that is able to have robust connectivity. So I'll stop there.
Well, actually, that kind of leads to a follow-up question for both you and Jennifer, because I had the Elon Musk, embarkment on the list, which is an interesting thing, but it also is inclusive in this next question, which is, what are the main hurdles that you have for implementation and application of broadband in rural Texas?
Well, the challenge, so the reason that we just don't go out and put fiber in is you'll see people argue that fiber it costs twice as much as being able to do something else, so whether it's a wireless service or cable or DSL from a service provider, or putting a satellite in the sky. But when you look at over the life cycle, it's half the price of like a wireless service. And so really it's being able to look at what is the benefit and value to that community. And so the fact that you're able to have low maintenance and low cost of ownership for fiber, it really has that total cost ownership is much cheaper. The other thing is that you really have to look at what is the ultimate goal. There won't be anybody that in this industry that won't say that fiber is the ultimate goal. And so, when you look at interim technology, so you could use fixed wireless, which is being able to get fiber very close to home and then having a line of sight and being able to use a wireless signal to get to that home. And in some areas like West Texas, that might work out fine because, it's flat, you have a good line of sight and be able to do that, right? You don't have a lot of foliage or in areas. And what that does is allows you to get fiber pretty deep. And then as soon as you have those subscribers over time, you can keep deploying the fiber to get to that home. But I mean, if you think about like electricity, can you imagine if in the Rural Electrification Act in the 1930s, if we had said, well, if you're hard to reach, we're just going to give you really bad electricity. And if you've ever been to a third world country or anywhere where you have brownouts and a very poor, well, I guess Texas experienced that recently. You can't relegate people to really bad electricity or really bad water. So why would you relegate them to really bad broadband connectivity? And so, if you think about all the federal subsidies that go out, how do you apply for those? Right? You don't mail something in, you have to go online. And if the people who need this, this money the most are the ones who don't have connectivity. And what's worse is if you look at like the last relief that we just saw, it's about affordability. And so if you're stuck out in West Texas and you have some kind of satellite service and you're paying $200 to $500 a month for that service, and you get all these federal tax dollars to help subsidize that and make it cheaper, you're not really doing anybody any service. Where if you could put that money into infrastructure and be able to have gigabit service for under $60 and then subsidize that $60, that's going to make a big difference. And so, throwing money at poor service to make poor service cheaper isn't helping it. So what is going to help is there's a current bill out with both in the House and Senate. It's the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act with Majority Whip Clyburn and Senator Klobuchar that put out that has, it's a $94 billion bill, $80 billion for gigabit service. And something like that will make a difference. We're able to get this infrastructure out. And it really kind of builds on itself, because once you get everybody connected with fiber, then you're able to allow people to work and go to school anywhere. You're able to have remote healthcare anywhere, and you really improve your quality of life. And so then from that economic impact, then you're able to generate those tax dollars, and everything else kind of works from there. So it's really being able to get those people connected.
Well, so I obviously, with our pandemic last year, we all experienced working from home, learning from home. And although it was extremely convenient and we've managed to pivot with platforms like Zoom, I feel like sometimes I'm even more busy than I was when I was meeting with people in person, which has had its advantages. But honestly, I have missed the interaction of being with other humans. And so now that, at least in Texas, we're a lot more opened up, it's been nice to kind of do business even at a socially distanced space, just to see, a friendly face and human touch. And so, putting my parent hat on, having my children learn from home was interesting. I'm definitely not a teacher. God bless the work they do. But what I noticed is that they not only were struggling with some of the things they were learning, but also they missed that human connection. And even if it's, with another student, with a teacher. And so I'd like to kind of talk about some of the, what the positive impact is on education in rural communities, and also some of the drawbacks of relying on online communication versus in-person learning. So Kara, I'll start with you on that.
Let me unmute myself. I'm just going to share a couple slides with all of you. So what I wanted to say is that I'm an enormous supporter of broadband efforts, and I think they really could be very helpful in education and also do wonderful things for the economy. So I do want every student, to have broadband access, and I think that that's something important for Texas to invest in. But I want to touch on a little bit today, what we found were some troublesome spots with online learning. And so when we're talking about doing more learning online, what's getting everybody broadband is wonderful, but how do we make learning online effective for our Texas students once they have that broadband access? So what I want to show you is a little bit what has happened to our students during COVID. We call this the statewide learning loss. Some people call it learning interruption, but it's estimated that our STAR scores are going to go down about 10%. And we were already a state that was really struggling to get students to read and do math at grade level. So what I did here is the last time our students took the STAR test, I got to do my little soapbox. Every single STAR question is written by a Texas teacher in the grade that the student is being tested. I know there's some resistance to STAR, and it's also tested on hundreds of thousands of children. And there's very few complaints about the actual STAR questions. And every single parent can look at every single STAR question, how it aligns to the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, how their student answered the question online. But the key thing to know is that these are the expectations that teachers in the classroom in Texas have for all Texas students. And that's what the STAR is testing. So when we look at our STAR data, prior to COVID, the last time the STAR test was given was 2019. And third grade is considered sort of the biggest metric in all of education, I would argue, is how many students you have reading at grade level out of third grade. And we can see that across the state of Texas, prior to COVID, about 45% of our students were reading at grade level. Said another way, 55% of our third graders, or hundreds of thousands of children, were reading below grade level. We think that when we get the STAR results back, students are going to be sitting for the STAR this coming spring, that we're going to see about a 10% decline. So now we're going to only have 35% of our students reading at grade level, which means 65% are going to be reading below grade level out of third grade. Now that's for the whole state. When you start breaking down the demographics, you see that we really are losing ground for our African American and our Hispanic children, and we really depend on ensuring those students are reading well for our economy. So one of the questions is why are we going to experience this really significant learning loss? And I think that some of the things that we found out are, one, a lot of our students don't have online connections. But even if they had an online connection that was reliable, it was extremely difficult, especially for young students and at-risk students, to learn at home. And I know any mom that was out there that was trying to teach several kids, found out that online learning is really a tough proposition for young students and at-risk students, if you're at risk for any reason. In addition, what we found out that was very interesting is that we have a lot of problems getting Hispanic students to go online and stay online. We're not really quite sure, and there's certainly people digging into this data, but we have a lot of Hispanic children in the state that are just not in school right now. They're not doing it online, and they're not doing it in person. And obviously this is a demographic that we need to be very successful going forward. So it's a little scary that these students are just kind of gone. So when we look at online learning, I would just say it's not enough to just think if we give everybody broadband, that's going to be a panacea for a lot of our education problems. A lot of our school systems have broadband right now, and we still don't have a lot of children reading in this state. So when we look at giving everybody broadband, we also have to look at what are we doing with that broadband to make sure the use of it and the tools that we're using to teach our students are actually effective. Now, I'll give you an example of an extremely effective program that relies on computers. The Commissioner of Education, Commissioner Marath, started what's called Math Innovation Zones. And as part of the Math Innovation Zones, students from kindergarten through 8th grade learn math on a computer. The computers are wonderful because they can automatically assess students. They can give you real-time feedback. The students can progress at their own pace. But the commissioner doesn't just say, here's the online computer program. Every teacher that's teaching as part of the Math Innovation Zone is getting a lot of support on how to use computers effectively. In addition, the students themselves are given a lot of support on how to use that tool effectively. So we think about broadband, and we think about online, and we think about education tools. We just have to be thinking about how do we put the most effective online tools in front of our students, and that we probably need the majority of our students in a classroom working with a teacher. We can't just depend on online for the vast majority of our students to do the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. And you had me think of something when I was doing online learning with the kids. One tool that I thought was really great was Raz Kids, because I have a second grader. And so being able to, read, have it read to you, read the book yourself, take the quiz, get the assessment. I thought that was really great. So to your point, there are some great tools out there. It's just kind of knowing how they can be best implemented. And if you'd close out your screen, thank you. So with that, I wanted to move to Christy now. Again, speaking of the pandemic, I actually use telemedicine on a couple of occasions with my children. And I'm going to be at the Capitol tomorrow morning. The Committee on Public Health is addressing a slew of issues related to public health, healthcare, telemedicine, as it pertains to broadband and access, obviously in particular to some of these rural communities who are in need. And so I wanted to know more about, what are the opportunities like telemedicine that broadband can provide in the public health space, and also getting your perspective as it relates to hospice.
Sure. So I first want to say I really would love broadband because I have a territory. I do home visiting, and my territory is 2,155 square miles. It is larger than the state of Rhode Island. And I drive more than 500 miles a week, and I carry 2 different Wi-Fi hotspots with me when I go, because I can't do my work in some of the places that I go to visit my patients. Because I just don't have access to be able to reach pharmacies, to be able to review medical records and charts and things like that. So I cover a very large rural territory, and I think that I want to talk about several different pieces of this. First, as you mentioned, the COVID pandemic, as we have launched vaccination, access to vaccines has been impacted by people's access to the internet to even figure out how to register for and obtain appointments. We have in the urban areas, people just wake up at 4 o'clock when the appointments go online and hit refresh until they get an appointment. If you don't have a good connection and you live in a rural area, there are lots of people who haven't been able to access their vaccines yet. And we have a big discrepancy between counties as to who's being vaccinated first. So that's one thing just really pertinent, specific to the COVID vaccine. But the second thing is that since they expanded the use of telemedicine services for the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of medical practices who have used telemedicine visiting with their patients has increased to 77% of all practices have used telemedicine with their patients. And that's a fabulous thing to have available for your kids with strep throat and just for refills of medications and any small urgent care problems. It's wonderful to have that accessibility. Telemedicine is also augmented by a lot of a new technology that I think many people don't think of when they think of broadband and healthcare and access to healthcare. But there have actually been, since 1977, remote patient monitoring devices that rely on connectivity to convey information into clinical offices. And they have things that are as simple as wearable devices like your Fitbit that can monitor heart rate, and they can monitor for wandering and falls in patients with dementia. They have simple monitors that you can use in conjunction with a telemedicine visit that can make the telemedicine visit that you've done over a Zoom screen much more pertinent. For example, they have remote stethoscopes where the clinician can actually say, okay, move the stethoscope to the left, move it to the right. They can actually listen to your heart sounds. They have monitors for pulse oximetry, temperature, blood pressure, all of the regular vital signs. So those are sort of some of the more simple types of remote patient monitoring that can be done. But there are also more advanced remote patient monitoring devices. A lot of these are cardiac devices. There are also devices used even with patients who are doing home dialysis. And that information is critical to be able to transmit that information in somewhat real time. And they even have some devices that can communicate back to patients if there is a problem noticed on the monitoring device in somewhat real time. They have the wearable devices, and then they have the implantable devices. And right now in the United States, there are 23.4 million people who have remote patient monitoring devices. But these devices will only work within certain limitations. Some of them like I said, convey information all the time. Some people who are not able to access those have to have a little wand. They have to establish a connection. They have to scan their device. It sends the information to the doctor's office, and it makes the process take a little bit longer. And as a clinician, you can't respond to the information until the patient can scan the device and have a good connection and send it into you. And so they're estimating that these remote patient monitoring devices are actually really are taking off right now, especially in the field of cardiology, but in many other areas as well. And they're estimating that in just 4 years, in 2024, there are going to be 30 million people with remote patient monitoring devices that need to rely on some form of communication to get the information back to where they need to go. And they've also shown that using remote patient monitoring improves patient satisfaction, because if the doctor already has all your vital signs, if they know what your EKG looks like, if they know all of these things, it's a much more efficient visit. Both doctors and patients want to improve the efficiency of their visits. But then the other things that they've actually shown in the UK, where they've been doing a lot more consistent remote patient monitoring, they've improved patient compliance from 20% to 80%. You know, when you go to the doctor's office and they say, oh, just take your blood pressure every night for me and write it down. And about 20% of the people will do that. But if they have a device that they know is communicating with their doctor's office, 80% of the people will actually do that. And then they've found that in the same study in the UK, they found that it actually reduced mortality rates by 45% in seniors. And then they've done another study more recently at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center that with remote patient monitoring, they were able to reduce hospital readmissions by 76% in patients with advanced heart failure symptoms. And so, you know, being able to access both medical visits and medical monitoring that can happen 24 hours a day really improves the health and safety of our patient population. When I'm going out to my rural areas, you know, driving across this vast expanse of Texas, I go places where I have to walk out of the patient's house and down to the end of the driveway to try to call something into a pharmacy. I mean, there are places that are that remote. And, you know, if you think about being able to reduce hospital readmissions by 76% just by having improved monitoring versus having to walk down the block to call something into the pharmacy, that's just a huge disparity that our patients are living with. You know, I think that there are more and more technologies, more and more advanced technologies becoming available, and they have the ability to really improve people's quality of life, but only if they have access to using them and have access to having follow-up visits. And if you can do a follow-up visit over the phone, it's much easier to do that than to have to drive into the city to see the doctor. And especially for specialist visits like oncology and cardiology services, those visits take much longer to even get into a visit. And then, you know, being limited and having to drive into the visits when something like heart failure really needs to be monitored once a week at least. It's a huge burden on our rural communities to try to monitor their heart failure symptoms once a week for most appropriate care. So those are just some basic examples of how healthcare is changing in real time.
Right. Well, and I'm going to open it up to questions after this last question, because this really kind of brings it all together. You know, Gary mentioned that there's legislation being proposed at the federal level. Jennifer and I mentioned the legislation at the state level, and then Kara talking about how, you know, education is kind of reworking how they integrate the online platforms with you know, education and really keeping kids moving in the right direction. So I think the main question we all would like to know is, as we're trying to, you know, move the needle, have more policy and procedures for how this works, what is the process for a community gaining access to broadband? And I'd like to kind of get each of your perspectives on once and getting the access, and then what a community can do once they have it.
Yeah, I'll start if you want. So what we saw this past year in 2020, that 88% of the CapEx investment in fiber was from small providers. And so what's happened is communities around the country, who have been waiting for their incumbent providers, whether it's AT&T or Comcast or someone, to be able to provide them broadband, if they're not an NFL city, they're out of luck. And so those communities have had to step up. And so what we've seen is municipal networks be set up. We've seen rural electric co-ops be able to start providing broadband. Or so basically, what has to happen is if you don't have gigabit service, then your community can step up and do that. And that's one of the things. We have a conference in Nashville in July, and we are doing a fiber broadband community toolbox where we're helping communities. What's the first step in being able to do that, and the whole process from building community will to how to do feasibility studies and get it moving forward. But at the end of the day, if a provider is not giving you gigabit, then you got to do it yourself and get your town to do that.
Jennifer?
So we're Connected Nation Texas is actually working with almost 36 rural communities across the state through the support of the Texas Rural Funders. And so what we're working on with them is really building community technology action plans. And as Gary said, presenting the data on paper and meeting with providers and learning if those incumbent providers that are there are willing to meet the needs of the community or if they're not. And so it's arming the communities with data that we find to be really, really crucial and important to then have those conversations with providers that may be in the area or other providers that would like to be in the area. And then having that data so that if we look at all the new federal funding that's coming, the EDA has started actually providing dollars for fiber rings. We're seeing that out in West Texas in Ward County. They were able to use data collected through their community survey to support their application to the EDA with some community match, but they actually got over $1 million from the EDA for fiber in Monahans, Texas. And so having that data and that community involvement to then go after all the dollars that are going to be available for that infrastructure, I think is really key. And so, first we're working with who's there, but if that's not going to work, you've got to move forward on your own, just as Gary said.
Kara?
So there's an enormous amount of money available to school districts from the federal government. In fact, I think the governor did a big announcement yesterday to help school districts get broadband. And I think one of the messages has to be, if you're a school district that's lacking some of these resources, do everything you can to avail yourself of these opportunities to help finance the broadband. But then you have to think of, after you get the grant money, and some of the things communities have to think about is if you want computers in your systems or in your classrooms, how are you going to procure them? Are there opportunities for community or providers to buy those for you or service them for you? Because even once you have the computers and iPads and things like that, you have to keep them up to date, right? And there's always technical issues. So you need a technical team at your school to deal with some of those things. The most amazing thing about online learning is if you could really get it up and get it going for your high school and your older students, especially those that are on track that don't need like a high touch from teachers, you could put the best teacher in the whole world in front of them to teach a lesson. So in your rural communities that do not have access always to all of the classes that are available. I know a lot of communities don't have classes, AP classes, or they might not have access to a training program. You could bring that whole training program to them, which is utterly amazing. For your younger students, and that was kind of my word of caution before, what you really have to think about is how do we use technology effectively with younger and at-risk students who might need high touch? And that's where you get into what are the most quality products that a school can procure and actually use. And when we say blended learning, we mean the teacher is using a computer to help assist with that classroom instruction. And there again, there could be amazing breakthroughs. I'll let you know that Commissioner Morath thinks that if more schools were using the Math Innovation Zone, so we're using a high quality blended learning math program that is delivered through broadband, it would make Texas the #1 math state in the nation. That is how powerful this, these blended learning situations with a teacher that's assisting the student on a computer can be. So thank you.
And Christy?
I think that the power of an anecdotal story, the power of an individual's case study can be very moving when you're speaking with individual legislators to get through the door and say, if this patient could get to a cardiology clinic once a week, we could improve their health outcomes, rather than saying all of this number of people need to have access to broadband. You're helping both the individual who needs to get into a cardiology appointment once a week, and you're helping the whole entire community. And so I think that in healthcare, it can be very powerful to use both the individual case study of, an individual face to the story, as well as using, some of this really rich data that shows how much remote patient monitoring can actually improve health outcomes. And, just using this as a way of highlighting the changes in the healthcare market and how they're related to connectivity.
That's great. Thank you. Well, to our folks on Zoom tonight, does anyone have any questions? If you do, you can put them in the Q&A box, and I'll give folks a minute. I don't see any as of yet. Anyone? Well, I really appreciate you all being here tonight. We're actually perfect on time. I think you provided a very relevant and robust discussion for our audience and everyone who's watching on Facebook. And should anyone have any follow-up questions or need any additional information, please make sure that you see my contact information in the chat box. But for all of you out on Facebook, you can follow us at treadcoalition.org, and you can email me at info@treadcoalition.org. And obviously this is going to be an ongoing discussion, so we look forward to having a deeper dive with some of the educational pieces. Obviously healthcare isn't going anywhere, and we'll be watching this legislative session. And I'd love to continue this conversation and circle back with you all on a later date for future TRED Talks. But that concludes our TRED Talk this evening, and I thank you all so much and hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.